Hello and welcome to the Coaching Crowd podcast with me, Zoe Hawkins, and my friend and co-host Jo Wheatley.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's session, which is all about the art of summarizing in coaching. And the reason that we're talking about that is when we are training on our coaching qualifications and some supervising coaches, we often hear about and observe different styles of summarizing, some that are really awesome and empowering and helpful in the coaching conversations, and some other styles of summarizing that can interrupt the flow of the conversation, can interrupt the insights or feel a bit repetitive. So we thought, let's have a practical conversation today about how to summarize effectively in a coaching conversation.
Yeah, and I think for those of you who are new to coaching, or like, what's summarizing? What does that even mean and have to do with coaching? Summarizing is a core coaching skill that enables a client to hear back and re-experience what they have shared. So in a coaching session, often a client is very much engaged in deep thinking, and they don't always hear what they've said, and they don't always necessarily keep pace with their own thinking because it's sometimes a stream of consciousness. So summarizing can be a really helpful skill that coaches can bring to coaching conversations to pace a conversation, support their clients to deepen their thinking, bring clients awareness to the language that they're using or the patterns of thinking that they're demonstrating through their language. So, it's one of the first skills we learn in coaching to help piece together a coaching conversation. Without summarizing, coaching conversations are very one-dimensional and can feel a bit like an interview. And so summarizing also helps to build rapport, soften the relationship, and soften the experience for the coachee. So it's got a really valuable place in coaching overall.
Yeah, and the art of that comes into being able to vary the way that you can use this, what can be a super helpful tool in a coaching conversation. So first up, I would say that you don't always have to do the summarizing as the coach. You can ask your client to summarize, and that might, they may have finished this stream of consciousness. You might just give a little bit of space before you then respond with, firstly, acknowledging that the client has shared a lot, or, what is it that needs acknowledging really in what they've just said. So, thank you for sharing that with me. I heard you identify a few significant insights within that. How would you summarize what you've just shared with me? And then the client might take, a few moments to really then start to, I think what it is a prompt for is consolidating their learning, sifting through and really identifying what the critical pieces are. And then that can help, you then can respond to that and say, you can explore how they feel about the way, what they have summarized for you. You can follow up by asking them what's emerging for them. So first up, it doesn't always have to be you as the coach summarizing. You can invite the client to do it, and that can have a lot of benefits.
Yeah. And of course, if it is you summarizing, the art of summarizing when it's you as the coach taking that role is to make sure that you're summarizing using your client's own words and you aren't interpreting what the client has said. So what we often see in new coaches when they're summarizing back is the coach has taken what the client has said, they've run it through their own sort of thinking, and then they're sharing back to the client their interpretation of what they've just said. And that can, to a degree, demonstrate a level of understanding, but you often get caught in this loop of like, that's not quite what I meant. What I actually meant was this. Okay, so I hear you saying, and then they're interpreting again. And then the client's like, to some degree, yes. And so the conversation doesn't go anywhere because you're just stuck in this tennis match between what the client has said and how the coach is interpreting it. When you summarize using the client's words, you're entering into the client's world. So a client might say, I'm experiencing this challenge at work. It's incredibly frustrating and it's having a real impact on my relationships at home. So if you're summarizing, you might simply play back, so I hear this challenge you're experiencing at work is frustrating for you. Yes. And the client typically then will go and build on that. So there's no need to interpret what your client is saying when you use their own language. And it's a much gentler experience for the client and it enables their thinking, which is the most important thing. Like, your thinking as the coach isn't really that relevant when it comes to helping the client through their problem. Like, your role is to facilitate, to ask questions. And so when you're summarizing using the client's own words, it enables them to build on and deepen their thinking, which is the key point of a coaching conversation.
Yeah, and I think you can combine the two that we've mentioned so far. So, say a client has been sharing stuff with you, and then you say, what's your summary around the new insights you've got, as an example, and the client says, I don't know, I've lost track of where I was. I know I was sharing a lot with you there. I was kind of caught up in the emotions of it. And then you might say to them, well, I heard you, and then summarize back a few of the key bits that you heard within that. And they might say, oh, yeah, I was saying that. And then you could follow up with a summarizing question, which is, what's most important, what are you taking away from that that's most valuable to you? So they're having to summarize in their head to then really be able to answer that question. So that would be combining those two things. And to build on what you were saying, Zoe, I think when a coach uses their own language, and I think there's a whole continuum of that, like from using only the client's language to using some of the client's language and some of your own to using only your own language. And I think they can have very different impacts with different clients. I think it's a risky strategy when you summarize using your own language, because sometimes the client might respond and say, oh my God, that's exactly it. Like using your own kind of summaries of it. They're like, oh, I've been searching for what that is. You've just hit the nail on the head. Which may in that moment be a fantastic moment of rapport, because your client feels completely heard and understood and thinks, my coach gets me, this is amazing. Will that help them in the longer term? If you maintain that kind of dynamic, maybe, but maybe not, because maybe it will reinforce a dynamic that, coach knows client better than client knows client. And so, have an awareness of that. So you might want to sprinkle different types of summarizing into it. In the other proportion, as I was describing, when the coach uses their own words to summarize it, and the client then is all they're thinking is, that's not what I said. That is not what I said. And they might feel angry and get preoccupied with the dynamic in the relationship between themselves and the coach, and then have completely forgotten about this actual thing that they brought to coaching that they want to work on. So that's where the risk lies, because obviously the client is coming to make progress on it. So you're balancing the need to build rapport and a safe psychological space with progressing the conversations and helping them to develop their thoughts and thinking.
I've seen some coaches summarize using their own words as a sneaky way to make a suggestion. So they might say, oh, what I think I heard you say there was, and then they weave in what they've been desperate to try and get the client to realize. And that's not the way to do it. What you're doing there is actually making an observation. And that's something that is worth contracting for and seeking permission for. So as you're kind of talking and you're hearing your client unfold their thinking, instead of summarizing back and wedging in your backdoor suggestion, you might say, there's something I'm noticing in what you're saying here. Would you mind if I shared an observation with you? And your client will usually say yes. And that's you say, something I think I'm hearing when you talk is, insert what you're going to say. Like, perhaps there's some resistance emerging for you in this topic, or whatever it is that you're sensing. And then you hand it back to the client, which is, what's your perspective on that? And the important thing is you're not hooked on it as a direction in the coaching conversation, but definitely don't use summarizing as your place to be like, oh, I think what I heard you say there is that you've got some resistance to this challenge, if the client has not used that in any way, shape, or form. So, you're knowing your coaching skills and when and how to use them in a coaching conversation is really important. And summarizing is a key thing that helps the conversation move smoothly, or as you've described, they can really disrupt the rapport and the dynamic.
Yeah, and on that point, we sometimes see coaches, that, oh, summarizing is a good skill to have as a coach. So I'm going to do that lots, but they do it all the time. So every time they ask a question and the client gives an answer, we might see a coach then summarizing back because they're coming through the lens of, I want to check my understanding and I want my client to feel assured that I am with them on this journey. I think it's really important to ask your client for feedback. Ask your client for feedback at halfway through the session, at the end of the session. How are you finding the session? You might find that the client says to you, I find summaries really helpful, but I don't need them after every question. It would be really useful to me if, when we've explored a particular topic, if you could help me to summarize what we've discussed and where I've got to. So calibrate with your coachee. Every client obviously is different, and some may find that super helpful. If you've got a client who uses a lot of words to say things, you may find that summarizing more frequently is really helpful. But if you've got a client who is able to be perhaps more agile in their answers and developing their thinking, then summarizing all of the time may be experienced as an interruption to them within that. So always ask for feedback on this.
Yeah. And I think another piece around the art of summarizing is to really listen to the word summarize. So sometimes when you hear coaches, you will hear them essentially like recounting what the client has just said. That's not summarizing, that's repeating. So there is a difference between repeating and summarizing. And summarizing is making some judgments around the key parts of a conversation. So you would do this, you would summarize a lot when you're trying to establish an outcome, for example, at the front end of a conversation. So a client might be saying, so you might ask, what would you like to focus on today? And the client would say, I'm not sure. Like, I think there's something about getting clarity over whether I take job A or whether I take job B. And you say, okay, so what I'm hearing is you've got a decision to make. Yeah. Okay, great. And you're lacking some clarity around A and B. Yeah. Not. So I hear that you're, coming to today with a lack of clarity about whether you take job A or whether you take job B. Like that's just repeating. So, you're making judgments around the key parts of the conversation that's useful for you to play back. Perhaps it's to gain agreement from a client, because what's the purpose of summarizing? In the outcome phase, it's to make sure that you've got a very clear contract together about where your conversation is going. If you're summarizing in the reality phase, the purpose of summarizing may be to help the client to deepen their thinking. So always have in mind, if you're going to choose to summarize, which parts are you going to pull out? And that affects the direction of a conversation. And why are you doing it? Don't just do it for doing its sake. Like there has to be a reason of where you would bring your summarizing into a conversation.
And if you are undertaking a coaching qualification, part of what you're required to do is critical reflection on your coaching practice. And sometimes coaches struggle to think of, the 99th example of something that they could do better. So perhaps today's podcast has given you an idea of something that you can do some critical reflection on. We encourage you to take a bit of time to summarize in your own mind what you've learned from today's podcast. Summarizing obviously applies to coaching, but also all conversations and that we have in our lives. So if you are thinking about training to be a coach and you want to delve deeper into skills like summarizing and many other communication skills to get better and more effective at it, then check out our website, igcompany.co.uk, for details of our next cohorts.